Well, hello then and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Can I introduce Steph? I have lots to say about Steph. Her work at the moment is in the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity at the Natural History Museum. And my note says in South Kensington. I bet there's nobody here hasn't actually been. He's previously worked throughout Hampshire as an ecologist. Now, I have a great CV here. If I read it out, I shall embarrass Stephanie no end, and I shall feel entirely inadequate myself. So suffice it to say that she's a council member and trustee of everything you've ever heard of. She's an avid natural historian, a specialist in bats, as in the flying things, and been fascinated by Gilbert White for a long, long, long time. I think that's enough, Stephanie. May I hand over to you?
Right, just putting my video up, so hopefully you can see me. Thank you for that, David. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you as well to the Friends of the South Downs for inviting me to speak this evening, and of course for everyone who's come along here tonight to give up a little bit of their Tuesday evening to hear me talking about Gilbert and Gilbert's work on the South Downs. So in this evening's talk, I'm going to be talking to you for a little while about a subject I've been fascinated by for many years. Gilbert White, a man whose methods of study of the natural world has influenced how we do natural history right through to today. And of course, on Saturday, we're going to be celebrating Gilbert's 300th birthday. And I hope many of you will be able to join me and Kimberly, who's on the call tonight, and the Gilbert White Museum on YouTube for a full day long program where we'll be talking about all sorts of different aspects of Gilbert's life and legacy. Now, I've got a few images I'd like to share with you as part of my talk. So you're just going to have to excuse me for a second while I just share my screen so you can see those too. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Okay, I'm seeing some nods, so that's good.
Yes.
Excellent. So, the Reverend Gilbert White spent most of his life in Selborne, a small village just outside Alton in Hampshire, which I'm sure many of you know, within the Hampshire Downs, which is the westward end of the South Downs today. We can see here in this engraving, which many of you might recognise, is next to the frontispiece of the first editions of White's book, but it shows us an image of Selborne in the late 18th century. And we can see here that we're looking from the Short Lythe, which is this hill here with several of Gilbert's family members illustrated on it, looking over towards Selborne village. That's the church there. If you can just see it, you might be able to spot a little wiggly path heading up to the hangars there. That's the zigzag path. And even a glimpse of the little hermitage, the little folly up the hill. So that gives you an idea of what Selborne would have looked like at the time that Gilbert was living and working there. Now, many people think of him as associated purely with this place. While he may not perhaps have enjoyed coach travel all that much by all accounts, he wasn't as sedentary as many people imagine. He travelled relatively regularly to Oxford, London, and over towards Sussex. Each one of those at the time would have been quite a significant journey of many miles, so not insubstantial travel. And while he was doing that, he was, of course, looking at the wildlife around him in the places there, but as he was travelling around those landscapes as well. And I've just shared this image here. This is an image that I'm rather proud of, and you'll see it come up in anything when I talk about Gilbert White at the moment. This is an image that we made at the museum of Gilbert. It's taken from a colorized version of one of the two only known in-life sketches of Gilbert. He never sat for a formal portrait, but the Gilbert White Museum did a colorized version of one of those two sketches, and we've taken and turned it into this mosaic picture, and the image is made up of thousands of tiny images from the digitized version of our UK collections at the museum. Just to give you a little flavour of the man. So as a curate of a number of nearby villages to Selborne, he would have travelled widely across the Downs, and many people have painted a picture of Gilbert as this slight, kind, thoughtful man travelling along the Downs on foot and on horseback, both alone and in the company of his friends, brothers, nieces and nephews. Now, why was Gilbert different though? Why do we know him today? Why are we still talking about this curate from a rural village in Hampshire? There are several things that set Gilbert apart from other naturalists and other members of the clergy of the time. But the reason we, of course, mostly know Gilbert today is from the strange survival of his marvellous book. The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne is still the fourth longest constantly in print book in the English language. It has never been out of print since his brother published it in 1789 at Benjamin and John White Publishers, Horace's Head, Fleet Street. You can see on the bottom of the frontispiece here, this is from our copy of it, well, one of our copies of it in the museum's special library collections. And you can see there, published for B. White and Son at Horace's Head, Fleet Street. There are now over 400 different editions of the book across 7 languages. It is in itself a marvellous story of publishing as much as it is a story of natural history. It has survived as it paints a portrait of an almost lost idyll of southern England. It's as much a story of the Downs as it is of anything else, describing life and the wildlife that Gilbert was observing so closely, written within a series of letters penned by Gilbert to 2 of his key correspondents, Thomas Pennant and Daines Barrington. These 2 were White's most regular correspondents, although he did meet and write to many other naturalists and scientists as well. These were the 2 that really built the story of Gilbert and Gilbert Selborne. He would have met them initially on visits to London at his brother's bookshop. This was a rather shrewdly located building, almost opposite the entrance to the Royal Society, of which Barrington was then vice president and Pennant a well-known fellow. Indeed, many of Pennant's publications, including later editions of his most famous British zoology, were produced and sold through the White Publishing House. Now, the map that you can see here on the screen, this was produced in 1740, so it's a little earlier than the publication of Gilbert's book, but it's going to be pretty similar. And you can find the majority of this street layout on any modern map of London. To give you a sense of place, I'll just find my cursor, there we are. This is St. Paul's here. We're going up Ludgate Street onto Ludgate Hill to Fleet Bridge. You'll notice that the Fleet is still open. I'm not sure it would have been particularly fragrant at the time. And this line marked in orange here, this is Fleet Street, running over to Temple Bar, which was of course still in place at this point. Now this blue line here, this marks Cranes Court, a very small little alley really between houses, and it's still there today. What isn't there today is this little collection of buildings at the end, and this was Royal Society House. This was the first home of the Royal Society. Sadly, it's now under a mismatch of rather ugly modern buildings, which is a shame. But notice where Cranes Court comes out. It tips out straight onto Fleet Street. And Benjamin's clever location for his booksellers was right here where this green arrow is pointing to. So all of those wealthy members of the Royal Society, people who would be looking to publish and could also afford good quality natural history books, would have walked right past his shop window. And of course, who can walk past a natural history bookshop? I certainly can't. Now, where Gilbert is set apart from other naturalists of the day is down to his observations of wildlife in their natural settings, at home and on his travels. While other naturalists were more focused on the study of taxonomy, that is the naming and classifying of plants and animals, most often taken from preserved specimens or just purely from illustrations of them, or alternatively were focused more on the uses, particularly of plants to humans. At the time, the study of medicine was intrinsically linked to the study of botany. To be a doctor, you had to be a botanist and understand the properties of plants. White, however, studied their behaviour as much as physical form. He's arguably best known for his studies of the swifts, swallows and martins, work which resulted in publication in the Royal Society's journal, Philosophical Transactions. As you can see here, this is how the debating chamber in the Royal Society at the time might have looked. But he also wrote letters covering some of the first descriptions of behaviour and appearance of species like the harvest mouse, one of course of the Downs' most endearing species, and what he called the great large bat, which is a species we now know as the noctule bat, one of our largest bat species. And that was all based on observations around the Downs. Now, I promised you a story about a tortoise, didn't I? I'm going to have to show you this photo again. I hate photographs of me, but this one I can tolerate. So this photograph was used as publicity for the talk, and it shows me holding a rather battered tortoise shell. It seems an odd thing to have associated with Gilbert White in a talk about the Downs. But this is the shell of a spur-thighed tortoise. For those of you who get the reference, it most certainly does look a bit like an abject reptile. Now that tortoise, and that particular tortoise shell, is very special, however, because this was Gilbert's pet. And the story of Timothy the tortoise is fascinating. Now, of course, I don't have Timothy to show you here today. I'm at home rather than the museum, and the shell is safely in the museum's collections. In fact, on display. If any of you have been to the Reptile Gallery, which is at the back of North Hall, you might probably have walked past it because it's right up on the top shelf. It's very fragile, but on studying of this specimen, we've been able to confirm that it's a female. So Timothy is in fact a female spur-thighed tortoise and rather well travelled, having come originally from one of the southern Mediterranean islands. Now, I'm not going to do in this story what a lot of other authors have done, including Gilbert, and I'm not going to tell this story from the perspective of Timothy. There are two fantastic books written as if Timothy was talking to you, and they're lovely, and I would thoroughly recommend them to you, and a wonderful letter that Gilbert wrote to one of his nieces on behalf of Timothy. But others can talk from a tortoise's perspective far better than me. But let's look at Timothy's journey and how he ended up crossing almost the entire length of the South Downs. Now, Timothy was bought by Mr. Henry Snook of Ringmer in Sussex from a drunk sailor for £half a crown in 1740. Now, perhaps a few of us can sympathise with the odd late night purchase after a glass of wine or two, but perhaps we haven't got quite as far as buying a tortoise as a result. This now pet tortoise was actually bought as a gift for his wife, Rebecca. And this is Rebecca Snook in her younger days, of course. She had kept several tortoises at their home in Sussex. Rebecca was also a favourite aunt of Gilbert White, and he visited roughly once a year, sometimes twice, most often in the autumn. If we look at today's map, we've got here Selborne, right on the northwestern extremity of the South Downs, and Ringmer over here, right on the northeastern extremity. So he would have had to travel right through the South Downs, all that landscape that we know so well, in order to go and visit his aunt. It's a journey of about 60 or so miles, depending on the route that you're taking. By car, with a following wind and a lack of traffic, it might take you perhaps an hour and a half today. If you're a keen cyclist and significantly fitter than me, you might be able to cycle it in perhaps 5 or 6 hours, perhaps looking something similar on a coach, depending, of course, on the quality of the roads at the time, and perhaps when you were traveling even. Now, Gilbert would have been 20 when he first met Timothy in 1740, and he seems to have been fascinated by her right from the start. Throughout his journals, which he kept from 1751, each visit to Ringmer is peppered with notes on Timothy. particularly concerning her weight and her hibernation habits. Gilbert was fascinated with the concept of hibernation and how it might apply to other species. Throughout his life, he was always wondering if species which disappeared in the winter were hibernating, species like the swift and swallow that he is so well known for. Timothy, we're back to Timothy again, spent 40 years living in that courtyard garden in Ringmer until Rebecca Snook died on Wednesday the 8th of March 1780 at the, well, for the time, grand old age of 86. Gilbert was actually in London at the time, rather than at Selborne, staying at his brother's Thomas's house in South Lambeth, which coincidentally is very close to where I'm talking to you from today. And he and presumably his brothers, Benjamin and Thomas, who were also in London, travelled down directly to Ringmer from London for the final time on the 12th of March, 1780. Gilbert doesn't make many notes on that journey. He only notices that there were no turnips to be seen on the road from London. But once he got to Ringmer, on the 13th, he notes that rooks are busied in building and crocuses are in full bloom. On the 14th, he noticed that chaffinches sing, but in a shorter way than in Hampshire. Now, I don't know if anyone on the call tonight is from Sussex and from that eastern end of the Downs, but I don't know if maybe anyone can confirm if chaffinches still have a shorter call than the Hampshire populations. Be interesting to see what people think of that later. On the 15th of March, he notes only Mrs. Snook was buried, and on the 16th only Primrose's blow. For me, reading his journals, it's almost as if he's seeking solace in his bereavement at the loss of his aunt, in the wonders of the natural world that he loved so dearly, but was just feeling unable to write at length. His notes at this point are clipped and short, but on the 17th, he started travelling home and notes, brought away Mrs. Snook's old tortoise, Timothy, which she valued much and had treated kindly for 40 years. When dug out of its hibernaculum, it resented the insult by hissing. Insult, there being written with a capital I, Timothy clearly objected strongly to this mistreatment, being dug out of hibernation. Timothy had in fact been left to Gilbert in Rebecca's will, the relevant extract of which is actually still in existence, and it's kept in the collections of the Selborne Society and stored at the Linnaean Society in Piccadilly. I've been very fortunate that I've been able to go through that collection and I've actually seen and attempted to read the terrible handwriting of that will. For the remainder of her life, Timothy lived in Gilbert's garden in Selborne, helping herself to lettuce, asparagus and melons, and occasionally suffering the indignities of Gilbert's investigations, being weighed, balanced on the edge of the ha-ha to see if she would fall, and in one instance being dropped into a barrel of water to see if she sank or swam. No wonder she looked a little bit abject at times. She survived Gilbert by only 1 year, dying in 1794. Eventually, her shell was passed to the Natural History Museum by Georgiana White, Gilbert's niece, and she now sits, as I've said, on display in our reptile gallery. I think we might even have one, possibly two of her past and present curators in tonight's audience, maybe. She may have lost a few scutes over the years, as you can see in this image. The white parts here, that's actually the bone underneath the tortoise shell. Scutes are these plates that sit on the top, what we recognize as tortoise shell. Unfortunately, what happens is you get, with different humidities and temperatures, the bone and the scutes expand and contract at different rates, so they can pop off and it becomes very fragile. It's actually terrifying to hold this specimen because you can almost feel it creaking, so we're very, very careful with it. She's a treasured part of our collections. She's been used in research into tortoise species, which the taxonomy of tortoises still isn't quite settled, and there are still arguments that rage about it to this day. And she's recently had a visit, or a spa break even, to our conservation labs for a thorough cleanup, and she's been 3D scanned as well, so we have a fully rotatable 3D image of her lodged in the internet. But what of that journey from Ringmer to Selborne? What would Gilbert's Downs have been like, and what would Timothy have seen on her journey? Now, maps from the period can be tricky to come across for rural areas, and quite often if you're looking at historical maps, you might need to create a composite of large-scale maps that don't fit together and don't marry up. However, this fantastic book of maps of England, Wales and Scotland from 1794 still exists. This is pages 15 and 16, and we'll look at a close-up in a second, but it's marvellous that we've got this fantastic set of maps still in existence. This was a year after Gilbert had died, so this is very much how the Downs would have looked to Gilbert and how he would have recognised it. By and large, the place names in this map are all recognisable, even though some of them may have grown significantly and some somewhat dwindled. A lot of the smaller villages and hamlets and a lot of the place names are very familiar to us as we travel around now. I've got to admit, I'm just going to highlight the original name of Brighton, Brighthelmstone. I personally prefer it, and I think we should bring that one back. Now let's look at this map side by side with today's. We can see again I've highlighted Selborne and Ringmer and Selborne on both maps. The one is actually much more detailed than the modern map that I've shared today. You can see it wasn't an empty landscape with no one there. Small hamlets and place names cropping up all over the place. Farming, of course, was important across that landscape. And while the practice of farming has changed significantly, of course, in the last 300 years, it's still a very important part of the landscape of the Downs as we know it today.
Something of this journey. You see Stedham on
as much as today. But with the quality of roads and of course the nature and quantity of traffic much changed. John Mulso, Gilbert's best friend, was not a great traveller and notes how the hill road down to Selborne was almost impassable condition in winter, with deep muddy ruts and water flowing down it, and how put off he was from visiting Gilbert by the condition of the roads. Gilbert himself travelled around the Downs on horseback, primarily when he wasn't doing long journeys, which had to be, of course, done by coach. And that travel was mostly done to cover his responsibilities as curate variously over the years at Westdean, Newton Valence and Farringdon, places which I'm sure you're all familiar with, or to perhaps visit friends and relatives. From that vantage point of horseback, he could observe wildlife readily. He was a keen ornithologist, so notes things like the arrivals of swallows and redwings, nuthatches rapping on trees, as well as the flowering times of his favourite plants like crocuses. There's a marvellous quote in one of Gilbert's letters to Daines Barrington from the 3rd of July 1778 in reference to the flowering of the crocus. He says, "This circumstance is one of the wonders of creation, little noticed because a common occurrence, yet ought not to be overlooked on account of its being familiar, since it would be as difficult to be explained as the most stupendous phenomenon in nature." What I like so much about this quote is that it exemplifies that White was as fascinated by the ordinary and common species seen every day, not just the occasional exotic migrant. And that is one of the reasons why he creates such a tangible portrait of the world around him that has generated this longevity. Walnut trees seem more numerous, at least from his records, than today. But the first butterflies he notes each year are also familiar to us. The brimstone appears regularly in his records in spring. But some of the other insects he records are all but lost. The field cricket particularly still present within the Downs and nearby landscapes, only due to reintroductions designed to save the species from extinction, which was very, very close in the 1980s. Now, Gilbert's records are particularly interesting to me as a naturalist because he is recording exactly how we do today. He's recording what he saw, where he was and when. Those elements are the critical factor in a modern biological record. With that data, we can build a picture or a snapshot of the wildlife around us now. Comparing that to historical data sets like those in Gilbert's records allow us to look at how wildlife has changed over the years. People recording wildlife today may call themselves different things: ecologists, biological recorders, citizen scientists even. But fundamentally, by recording wildlife and sharing those records as White did, they are undertaking the process of natural history. With constant collection of records over the years, we can look at how wildlife has changed over time, how populations have contracted, expanded, or moved, how population densities have changed, or how arrival times or flowering times have altered. We can then look at information like weather and temperature and how our climate is changing, or consider land use changes like the expansion of towns, changes to roads or farming, increased street lighting, pesticide use, hedgerow changes, woodland management practices, and consider how human behaviour has affected our wildlife. Within the Downs, we see a haven for wildlife stretching across the southeast of England. This allows a navigable landscape for a multitude of species, and the varying habitats and microhabitats created by the management of the Downs by its various landowners and guardians enables this to retain much of the character White would recognise. It is, however, as important today as then, if anything more so, to get outside and continue these records so we can monitor change into the future and continue our efforts to ensure that the Downs remain a haven for wildlife. To use the phrase that the Gilbert White Museum has been using a lot this year, my recommendation to you is to be more Gilbert. Take your notebook on a walk and record what you see. And most importantly, just like Gilbert, share those findings with others. Hampshire and Sussex are extremely fortunate to have a great network of biological recording groups. Got on the western side, the Hampshire Biodiversity Information Centre, and on the east, the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, where records can be collated, managed, and used to inform land management and conservation management and help protect the Downs for the future. That concludes my little talk for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. I think we're going to open up for a few questions now. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to me talk about my very favourite subject, Gilbert White, this evening.
Thank you very much, Steph. It falls to me to thank you for your talk and to lead the questions. For the benefit of the audience, my name is Glyn Jones and I am another trustee of the Society. Steph and I today were trying to work out how we knew one another. And many years ago, we met at a secret location deep beneath the Sussex Downs. And we'd gone there to look at what we then believed was the only mouse-eared bat in the British Isles. And that was an experience that I certainly will never forget, and a privilege that I'll never forget. So thank you for sharing that with me, Steph. Okay, a few questions. One here from another trustee, Caroline Douglas, and she'd like to know that if any of the species that are observed by Gilbert on the Downs are no longer with us.
So there are quite a few species which have declined significantly over the years. And one of the things that we always talk about in terms of species presence and species recognition is the concept that you always remember the number of certain species you saw as a child. So therefore you've got that constant deficit. You always know that there were less of something than when you were a child, or more of something, but you've kind of got nothing to compare that to. So there are a number of species that we know will have declined significantly across that landscape, but we don't know necessarily how many Gilbert was referring to when he saw them. So there are certain bird species, for example, like the yellowhammer, the skylark, and the linnet, which are all now red listed. Red listed means that their populations are in significant decline. They may not necessarily be rare, but we know that their populations are declining. And Gilbert was, of course, recording those across the Down. Probably the most obvious one to talk about here, though, is the field cricket, which I mentioned in my talk. That Gilbert refers to in some years as being very numerous, very local to Selborne. On May the 29th, 1791, he refers, however, to the race of field crickets which burrowed in the short lies and used to make such an agreeable shrilling noise the summer long, seemed to be extinct. The boys, I believe, found the method of probing their holes with the stalks of grasses and so fetched them out and destroyed them. Now, by the 1980s, the field cricket had declined to about 100 individuals in one location only. And an awful lot of conservation effort has gone in over the last few decades now to restoring those populations. The RSPB and other organisations, Natural England, of course, have embarked on a repopulation project for the species, which seems to have been successful, which is really, really good news. So we had one that very nearly got lost, but fortunately has been brought just back from that brink. I hope that answers your question, Caroline.
So I've got some more questions here from, I've got 3 from our chairman, David Sawyer, who introduced you. The first one is that has the Natural History Museum now reopened?
Well, that's actually almost perfect timing because, yeah, up until this morning, I wouldn't actually have been allowed to answer that because it's all been a little bit secret. But we announced today we are going to be reopening the museum from the 5th of August. It's only going to be Wednesdays to Sundays from 11 AM to 6 PM. And you have to pre-book your tickets. The tickets are still free, but they are limited in number. Those of you who've maybe been into the Natural History Museum on, say, a rainy afternoon, there can be up to 5,000 people in there at any one time. And of course, social distancing in that circumstance will be impossible. So we are limiting the number of people to come in to keep everybody safe.
Oh, good, yeah.
And are you going to require visitors to wear masks?
I am not privy to any information or conversations that have happened in the museum about that. Yeah, so I'm afraid I can't give you a definite yes or no on that, but of course we would be recommending them. I mean, I certainly will be, certainly the 3 times that I've been into the museum, I have brought one inside the museum.
Well, I personally think that's good news, but there we go. So we were talking about have we seen any extinctions since Gilbert White's time? But what do you think might be next on the list?
Next on the list, oh gosh, that's a that's a topic of conversation. I mean, the issue with the Downs, well, actually the advantage of the Downs is that it's such a large area. And what it allows is species to live at a large dispersed scale. And that means that we have got this amazing repository for wildlife on the Downs. The lack of fragmentation of the habitats can be really, really critical to maintaining that, along with maintaining diversity of both habitats and microhabitats within it. Now, I know there's been a Dark Skies initiative for the South Downs as well. And of course, that's important for keeping that permeability of the landscape existing even at night. So it's really important that those sides of things are retained. Those species that rely on traditional farming practices, things like the skylark and linnet and yellowhammer that I mentioned, and of course, plants that are characteristic of diverse and unimproved grassland are always going to be some of the most threatened species. And of course, with rapid environmental change and climate change and things like that, those species are going to be the ones which are more threatened, particularly those with very close interactions between, say, flowering times and invertebrate presence. So while there are certain things which just in terms of Downs management, we probably can't do very much about, ensuring that there is space for wildlife to exist is really critical to the Downs going forward, and making sure that particularly those characteristic unimproved diverse grassland swards are maintained, because if we start to lose the cohesiveness of those habitats, that's when we will see species changing, I think.
I've just had another question flip up on the screen, which takes us off on a bit of a tangent, but what was Gilbert's or what do you think was Gilbert's favourite animal?
Gilbert's favourite animal?
I think we can probably include invertebrates in there.
Gilbert's favourite animal. Now, I think his greatest puzzle was the migrating birds, so the swifts and the swallows, and he seems to have loved that thought puzzle, that thinking that through. He was obviously very fond of the harvest mouse because he talked about it regularly. I'm going to guess his favourite was probably either the swifts or the swallows, or maybe even the nightjar. He did like talking about the nightjar, of course.
Well, I share that with him. I went nightjar listening last week.
It's a fantastic thing to do. Yeah,
it's
years, and it's marvelous.
It's a great experience. I actually offered a guided walk for the society to go listening to goat suckers by moonlight, and one person turned up.
Just one.
Bad, wasn't it? There you go.
Everybody else missed out.
Now, the work of the Friends of South Downs is quite wide ranging. And we're always looking for projects that we should be supporting and we should be taking forward. And at the moment we're looking at seats and stiles, replacing stiles with gates and resurfacing bits of the South Downs Way. But we're also keen on some wildlife projects. Can you think of one particular thing that we might be able to help with?
One particular thing. Now, of course, the Downs is thought of as a very open landscape, but a key element within that open landscape is making it navigable and crossable for many, many species. And I would argue that, probably the biggest thing the society could do is to work with landowners and guardians of the South Downs and look at how to promote or reconstruct even perhaps some of those old connected hedgerows and things like that will of course allow more species to travel through the site. I know there's already been a lot of work done on the Dark Skies initiative and things like that, but it's about promoting that ability for species to cross that landscape. So brilliant that you're looking at stiles and things like that, but what about the hedgerows that connect them together and make that landscape permeable to so much wildlife? How does that feel a challenge?
Well, I think that's very interesting because in my career I spent my time trying to get rid of bushes on the Downs and trying to get back bare of officious fence or hedge, I think it was that it was described by Kipling. And I then argued that there was no tradition of hedges on the Downs themselves, but of course there was continuity of habitat, which we don't have now.
Yeah, and it's that continuity of habitat that is so important. And with the space of the South Downs, there is a space for that diversity of habitat, the big open landscapes, but then also those more connected routeways as well.
Yeah, well, we are actually at the moment investing in trees for the Downs with the National Park Authority. So that is a beginning in that direction. Okay, well, I have another question here. This one came from Tracy, who you've been liaising with. Is it possible to identify Gilbert White in relation to a single idea or vision for the future?
So that has to come down to Gilbert's method, his way of observing and communicating about wildlife, his enthusiasm for it. One of the things that I've used to describe this passion that comes through, if any of you remember watching David Attenborough, when he gets incredibly excited and incredibly passionate about something, that comes through in Gilbert, that love of observation. Doesn't matter if it's something rare, but that real life of a naturalist that you see come through. And we see that shining through in Gilbert's writing. We see it in so many of the natural historians that we love listening to, hearing about. People like Charles Darwin, of course, who was influenced himself by Gilbert. But it's that process of observing and that love of sharing what you found out about wildlife, I think.
So we're encouraging to work with family groups and young people. Can you think of any projects that we could encourage them to become involved in to take forward and help the wildlife diversity on the Downs?
There are so many things that families and young people can get involved with. Probably one of the most tangible things, aside from obviously task days like you were talking about, in terms of, you know, looking at habitat restoration and things like that, which is brilliant. Everyone loves getting their hands dirty and that sort of thing, or at least I do. But actually, you know, what about a wildlife recording project, so that families can go out and explore the Downs and have a little guide which they can record to, something that will start them on that process of observing the wildlife around them, looking at what's there critically, even if it's just, you know, at the start, perhaps simple things like drawing and observing something through critical, actually genuinely focusing on something, or getting some real records in, which will help promote biodiversity and add to our understanding of the Downs.
Is there anything you think that people could do at home, particularly with when they're at home now in lockdown? Looking, I mean, I've certainly seen a lot more people out taking exercise and walking. But is there anything useful they can do at home?
Absolutely. Gardens are a forgotten resource. Our gardens particularly cover a huge area. You know, we're very lucky that I'm extremely lucky that even though I live in the middle of London, I've got a shared garden that I can get out in. And even right here in a very busy central London location, we've got so much wildlife that comes down to the garden. If we've been recording this earlier in the day, I've been half drowned out by the sparrows in the garden. And it's very simple to bring a multitude of wildlife to your garden. Leave even a little patch of your lawn to grow a little bit longer. If you've got space and it's safe to, pop a little pond into a corner, and maybe, just maybe, have a look, instead of at exotic shrubs and things like that, look at our wonderful native plants. You can buy fantastic plants. I've actually created myself 3 little planters, all of native species. Now, it's not a species group that you would find in any habitat description, certainly, but it's beautiful. Right now it's full of oranges and yellows and white flowers. It's absolutely bursting with life and it looks fantastic, but it's all native species, and you can see the clouds of bees and flies and butterflies all coming down to it, and it's absolutely marvelous. Our gardens are fantastic resources for wildlife. There's so much you can do, and of course there you can spend hours turning over logs and stones and looking at mini beasts, or getting out there and actually watching some of those bees that are in your garden as well. Some of them are fantastic and diverse, and a really fun group to start to get to learn as well.
Well, that's interesting. In our last e-newsletter, we were encouraging people to read Dave Coulson's book, Stinging the Tail.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a great
where he gives some similar advice. So,
excellent. I'm glad we agree.
Did any of Gilbert White's descendants carry on his work?
Now, Gilbert never married, so he never had children of his own. But he did have a large family with a lot of surviving brothers and sisters, and they, of course, had children. Now, Thomas and Benjamin obviously were part of the Royal Society. Thomas certainly was a naturalist. John, one of his other brothers, was an active recorder, and that seems to have passed on to Jack, who lived with Gilbert for a number of years as well. I think I'm right in saying years rather than months. But I'm afraid beyond that, I don't really know. Certainly there does seem to have been this tradition within the family of recording weather patterns and wildlife, and a real interest in natural history. But I don't personally know how far down the family tree that might have gone. I'd love to think that there are still various descendants of Gilbert White scattered out there, all busy taking biological records. If anybody knows, if anybody's going to come up and say that they're a long lost descendant of Gilbert White and they are still a very active recorder, I would love to hear it.
Thank you. There's one from me, and I'm almost sort of scared to ask this one. What I want to know is how optimistic you are. There are a lot of people who think that no matter how hard we try, we can only preside over the gradual demise of our wildlife and loss of biodiversity. What do you think?
I prefer to be an optimist. I do. There are many things when you're studying natural history and wildlife, and you're looking at environmental change, and you're reading the news and you're reading journals, and they can make you incredibly down and depressed about our state of wildlife. What I've seen though, particularly over the last few months during lockdown, is people really reaching out for that connection back to nature and connection back to wildlife, and actually starting to see what's there right on their doorstep, right in the middle of towns and cities across the country. Now, we ran back in April a project that we've run for the last couple of years. It's called City Nature Challenge. And normally we try to get people to come along, and we get a good number of people coming to see us and other places around London, and we're in competition with cities around the world. But this year, during lockdown, even when we couldn't get out there and we couldn't do very much ourselves, we managed to get more records to that one little weekend-long project than we've ever had in all of the previous years before, because suddenly people were desperately looking out of their windows and seeing wildlife and seeing that there's a place that was interested in even the common things, the things that people do know and feel confident in recording. And that actually itself gave me a bit of hope for the future. The other thing which does give me a lot of inspiration is that through the Natural History Museum and through my work at the Angela Marmont Centre, I get to work with a lot of young people and a lot of youth organisations and youth groups who are particularly interested in natural history. And the enthusiasm and passion and drive that's there in some of these, kids standing. We did a conference in September last year with a large group of young people. A group called A Focus on Nature, and we had speakers at that conference standing up and talking about their experiences in natural history, age I think 11, standing up in front of a group of people and talking about what they'd seen in natural history and what they were doing, campaigning for wildlife. And that was fantastic, because age 11, there is no way I would have been confident enough to do anything like that. And that was from that age through to people in their 20s, really taking that inspiration of natural history, passion for conservation forward. And that really does give me hope for the future.
Excellent, excellent. I think I've run out of questions now. I'd just like to thank you, Steph, for taking us on that wonderful journey with Gilbert White. I mean, I have read the book, and I hope most of the others have, but that was special. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you for your optimism and hope for the future. I'm sure you're right. We can make a difference, and the recent enforced leisure has reminded many of us of that. We've even seen wildlife returning to places where you didn't expect to see it. So
absolutely, yeah.
So that was great. Thank you. If we get any more questions in, I understand you're happy to answer them later. A question. Sorry, although I said I finished, one more question has come up, which I can read, and that was to ask, what actually got you interested in the first place?
Two things, actually. The first one I can remember, and I grew up in Dorset, down near Corfe Castle, which of course is another amazing place for wildlife. So I was very lucky to grow up there, and of course surrounded by the natural world. But there are two real things that I think got me interested. First of all, when I was at primary school in the village, we had a visiting speaker come in from the Dorset Wildlife Trust, and he took us, I think we were probably about 6, took us on a walk around the edge of our playing fields, and he showed us a fox earth. And I remember him vividly saying, "You will never forget the smell of this." And he's right, I know exactly what a fox earth smells like now. But I remember thinking, age 6, wow, I'm never going to forget that. Brilliant. And that's just one of the things that's always stuck with me. And of course, with bats, which is my particular interest, I went on a bat walk with Leeson House, which is a little field study centre near Swanage. And we went on a bat walk and we saw bats flying around, and I was hooked. So that was the final straw for me, in my depths of nerddom really came through, I think, at that point. So I think I've always been surrounded by wildlife, though, and it's always been inspiring.
The questions are coming in thick and fast now. Now we're saying goodbye.
Right.
We're hearing a lot more recently about rewilding. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Gosh, that's a big subject. So you've got another hour for another talk, right? Done well and with thought and with care, we've seen some wonderful examples of rewilding over the years, both in the UK and across Europe. And of course, you know, Knepp Estate is heralded as an exemplar of the conversion of farmland to a rewilded state. There is a fantastic opportunity within some of our landscapes for that to happen. It needs thought, and it needs to be well planned and well monitored to see how it's working. But there's real opportunity there, certainly. I'm trying not to go off on a 2-hour waffle now.
Well, I'm fortunate to live just down the road from Knepp Estate in Storrington, named after the storks, which are now back on the Knepp Estate, which is
fantastic.
Is rather nice, yeah. There's one final plea that's coming through: is can you living and working in London, you've got a special position there. Can you please arrange to take Boris on a walk in the countryside?
We'll lose him.
Yeah. We do get regular visits from government. As far as I'm aware, we haven't had Boris come in, but we do get regular visits from politicians who come into the Natural Museum and Natural History Museum and into the UK Biodiversity Centre, and hopefully are inspired by what they see.
You can't fail to be inspired by that building if you're not inspired by the contents.
I get inspired by that building every single day.
I remember it as a museum of museums.
Yeah. It's an absolute gem, and I am incredibly privileged to get to work there. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Steph. I've had a great evening, and I'm sure everybody else has. I will look out for another opportunity to hear you speak, because it's been very informative and very enjoyable. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. I've loved building that talk for you, and really, really fun evening. And thank you very much for inviting me. And of course, got to do a last little plug for Saturday, Gilbert's 300th birthday. Kimberly is cheering. I can see her on the screen there. Kimberly James is from the Gilbert White Museum. They're doing a day-long conference on YouTube, I believe. And there's a talk from me and another chance for some Q&A with me on Saturday at 5 o'clock, I think.
Well, I'm sure there'll be many of us there. So once again, thank you very much, Steph. It's been great.
Thank you very much. Good night.